these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office. Experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all. In-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Welcome back, listeners. Have you ever wondered what it's like to be in the CIA? You've seen Jason Bourne movies, maybe watched every episode of Homeland. There's even other really good shows that I don't know if I've mentioned here, like The Recruit, the comedy, kind of a dark comedy, or The Patriot, the best dark comedy on the CIA. That's on TV, where today we have a guest who spent 35 years in the CIA with us, Ralph Goff. Wait, did I get your name right?
Yeah, that's fine.
It's Goff.
Yeah,
is it Goff? I don't know if it's Job or Goff. I've known you for a while, but I should have known that. Served extensively all over the world, Europe, Middle East, Asia. Thanks for being here today and willing to share your experiences. So I'm excited about this conversation. I think maybe that we'll talk about all sorts of different topics that you have an amazing insight on. Like I said, we've known each other for a little while, and I've heard you speak at other places, and I really appreciate your insight. But I kind of want to talk about your personal history. Like, how did you even end up in this job? Were you prior military, or what?
I am. And first of all, thank you, Dan, for having me on. That's a great opportunity. I've enjoyed following your career as well. So it pleases me to be able to come here and have a chat with you. But yeah,
my career's fun to watch from afar. I don't know if it's fun for
Yeah, exactly. That's true of any career almost, particularly in the government.
Politics,
yeah. So, I grew up in Connecticut, and my mom was a German immigrant. My dad was a soldier in the late 50s, and they got married. So I already had kind of a connection overseas as a little kid. And my mom used to take my sister and I over to Germany. And I can remember being there as a young kid in 1968 when the Soviets crushed the Prague Spring. And I remember all my German relatives were freaking out, and because they thought the Soviet machine was just going to roll into Germany. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of I was like 9 years old, and that was kind of my first awakening that, who are these Soviets? Who are these Russians? Yeah. Then years later, I was in high school, getting ready to graduate. I was a mediocre student, and my family would have really struggled to put me through college, and I kind of thought it was pointless because I didn't like school anyway. So, at that point, I was going to go be a force ranger, but instead, I joined the Army. They had a great GI Bill deal back then, and I joined the Army, and just on a whim, I took a language aptitude test, which turns out my language aptitude is way better than my math aptitude. And so the recruiter skillfully guided me into this Russian language school. Yeah. And I ended up working overseas in Germany and Turkey as an enlisted man, listening to Russian, or rather I should say Soviet military operations with the Russians. Mm-hmm. And when I got out, I had the GI Bill, went to University of Connecticut, go Huskies.
How long did it take you to really learn Russian well enough to listen to radio chatter and actually understand it? Because I grew up speaking Spanish, but if somebody's speaking fast over the radio, it's hard to pick up.
Yeah, it is.
Vocabulary
it is, but luckily military comms are brief, right? True. And but it doesn't help when we're listening like Russian tankers who they have a throat mic, but usually it seemed like they were wearing it around their crotch or something like that. But no, military language school. It was a year-long course, very intense, right? And I can remember when I first got there, I had my same lackadaisical high school study principles, and like week 6, I get called in to see the training officer, who was a colonel. I was a private at the time. I'd never spoken to anyone above the exalted rank of second lieutenant. Mm-hmm. So I go in and I see this full-bird colonel who tells me my grades are substandard and that I have 6 weeks to shape up or ship out. And he says, look, we'll give you a sheet. You can fill out 3 jobs, right? Whatever you want to take. But I can tell you right now, the Army needs cooks, tankers, and infantrymen. So, Mr. Goff, Private Goff, if you want to be a cook or a tanker or an infantryman, keep on the same course. So that's motivation. I went back, studied hard. And I can tell you, after about a year of this intense training, you can listen to intercepted communications and figure out what's going on.
Especially if you're training with specific vocabulary. I mean, I think of my Spanish I learned, it's conversational. Mm-hmm. But if somebody's talking about a certain topic, I'm like, I don't know those words.
Exactly.
I just don't learn them.
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. Was it nowadays we send a lot of people. I mean, Middlebury College is like one of the premier language colleges / schools. It's totally immersive. It's really interesting.
Yeah. That's still going, but like I was actually fortunate because when I went to University of Connecticut after the Army, I had a Russian language program, and I was in that program, and then in the summer up at the Norwich Military Academy, a private military academy, there was a thing called the Russian School of Norwich, and it was faculty of about 50, 60 Russian language teachers from all across the country who gathered there, and they would take in about 150 students. You had to apply for it. Yeah. And it was a full summer of full immersion in Russian and studying with these great, selection of professors. And, I did that for 2 summers. So by the end of my 4 years in college, my Russian was pretty darn good.
Okay. So sounds like you didn't have to go infantry. So
no,
you had that
I did not.
Colonel talked some sense into you.
But I spent a lot of time in the field in Germany, mostly listening to the intercepted communications of U.S. Fighting forces there and conducting electronic warfare against them. But we were also fortunate. We had our own SIGINT site up on the old East German border. We used to keep our skills sharp listening to the Soviets from there.
Okay. And how long were you in the Army?
4 years. 4 years, yeah. 4 years, just enough to pay for my college. So it was a fair trade, 4 years for 4 years.
Okay.
And I was going to go back to the military, but instead I ended up going into government. I ended up working at State Department for a couple of years and then shifted over to the agency.
Yeah. Okay. So foreign service made sense, right? Russian linguist, but you wanted something more adventurous.
I wanted something more adventurous. And I wanted to be, I wanted to be working and looking the Russians in the eyes. So I went to the agency, became what we call a case officer, and then they put me through training, also about a year, some language training for one of my first postings. I can say that in my career, I had to use Russian, German, Finnish, Serbo-Croatian, and Bulgarian. So, again, my math aptitude was not very good, but language aptitude was
You speak all those languages?
Not anymore. I've still got German and Russian, and I'm sure if I spent a drunken weekend in Finland, I'd probably speak Finnish by the end of it.
Yeah. It's amazing what just a weekend in an immersion will do. I mean, my Spanish gets rusty. I go down to Mexico for a bit, or Colombia,
exactly.
where I learned. And it's still rustier than it used to be, but it's not bad.
Critical language too, I would add.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of countries that speak it. It's like when you choose one, it's how many countries actually speak Italian? It's like kind of just one.
Yeah,
it's kind of just.
How many countries
Japanese.
speak Finnish?
Yeah, Finnish. It's kind of just one, but you're very useful there.
But that was one thing. The agency at one point with languages, I'll tell you one of my pet peeves about CIA is, we're a foreign intelligence agency, but we're not that great at languages. We need to do more. I was always impressed by
Americans
the
aren't
Russians.
that great at languages.
Yeah, I don't know what it is. I guess we just think everyone will speak our language, and that if they're important enough, they'll speak our language. But no, I was always a little bit peeved at that. And although it's amazing, we have grown some amazing linguists. I had one good friend who learned Arabic through the agency, but he had it to the degree where he could switch between Egyptian Arabic and Syrian Arabic
really
and Lebanese Arabic.
Because they're totally different words. I studied Arabic for a long time.
He was fun to watch in action.
That's impressive. I mean, we had this conversation in special operations too. Like how much, the reasoning is the same in the agency.
Yeah.
You have a ton of skill sets you need to have.
Right.
And a finite amount of time to develop those skill sets.
Yeah.
For special operations, it's like, okay, you got to learn to dive, you got to learn to jump, you got to learn to do land warfare, mountain warfare, and all different. There's a million things.
Yeah.
Where do you fit language into that?
Yeah.
And the answer is not very well. I mean,
right.
If we did, I did like a 3 month maybe of Arabic. Then you try to keep learning as you deploy.
Yeah.
In the Army, Special Forces they'll do more. They'll dedicate like 6 months, but I mean that's time away from shooting, moving, and communicating the things that keep you alive. But then again, language can also keep you alive.
Although to be fair, I've encountered many operators from the special operations community who spoke amazing levels of foreign language, whether it was Arabic or Pashtun or Russian or Chinese. I mean, there's always someone there who speaks it.
I wouldn't say it's common.
Yeah.
But I'm not even sure the right call is to put everybody through some serious language, because then you don't even know you're deploying, by the way.
Right.
You end up somewhere else. I think in the CIA, you can specialize a little bit better.
Yeah.
In special operations, we sort of regionalized, going back to that, but GWAT era was Nobody was regionalized anymore. It was everybody was going to the same place.
Yeah.
And again, it's finite resources. And a lot of people do speak English, or you have a translator, but it's good to know something just to build rapport.
Absolutely.
Like
Absolutely.
That's a big help.
And that's the key to human intelligence. It's rapport and assessing the other individual. One of the things I loved about being a case officer, we used to joke, anyone who thinks there's no such thing as a free lunch never worked for the CIA. I mean, we're out wining and dining our contacts, and that's when you're sitting there face to face, and that's when language really plays a key role. And again, if you don't speak their language fully, just having a few phrases just to show that, hey, I am interested in your culture.
What do you
I
call
respect
this?
your culture.
How do you guys say this? It's
Exactly.
Right, colloquial. It's just like it's a way to just make conversation.
Right.
Which is a key part.
Yeah.
I think maybe one interesting question that people might be wondering: how do you just go apply to the CIA?
So back in the day, it was. For me, it was just calling a number and then getting a response through the mail, the old-fashioned mail. Now they've got websites, and you can log in, and they've got super sockets for encryption and validation, and also
But your initial is just you literally just go fill out a form online.
You fill out a form online.
CIA.gov and go for it.
Yep,
right?
exactly. I mean, there is recruiting. There are people that go out and do recruiting across the United States and look for people. And I've been out now about a year and a half, but I've been led to understand that recruiting has still gone on quite successfly for the agency. That in spite of what some people think is the stigma these days of working in the government, and this is just the last 10 years, I would say, people looked at government work as maybe not desirable, but the agency has never really had a problem meeting their recruiting goals.
Well, there's a sort of a sense of mystique and mystery around it that I think it calls people to adventure.
There is.
We don't have a problem with the SEAL teams either.
Right. Right.
Luckily, I guess the military writ large is doing better.
Yeah.
So everything's looking up.
Yeah. Good to hear.
But it's not an easy process. So you fill out your form online, and then you wait for an email.
Yeah.
And it's like
it's a lengthy process too. I mean, and one of the things though the agency's been working on is shortening it. I mean, back in the day, it could take you up over a year to get what they call a conditional offer of employment. And then it could take another year for you to get your security clearance and be vetted adequately to get into the training. Unfortunately with the agency, because everything is considered super highly classified, they're not just going to bring people in and say, well, we'll clear you later, right? You've got to be cleared essentially before you walk in the door. And that can be a lengthy process. Yeah, polygraph. Which is never fun, but necessary. It's kind of like our only line of defense in some ways. It's an old technology, but it's still pretty reliable. Yeah.
It's
for
a great
people,
interrogation tool, right? Because it's like, well, I know you're lying, even if you don't know. Because the thing about those, it's obviously it's a flawed system. There's a reason we don't allow it in court, because you can ask me a question and I can be like, did you do X, Y, and Z? And I'm thinking of doing X, Y, and Z. Yeah. As you're asking, I'm like, well, it feels like I'm lying, even though I'm not lying. Yeah. But that being said, it's as far as getting the truth out of people, it's a fantastic interrogation tool for that reason. I don't know, maybe interrogation is not the right word. Questioning.
Tool.
What can you tell us about root training? I mean, there's books written about it.
Yeah, lots of books out there.
But because of both of our clearances, there's just things we can't say.
Right.
So
I mean, the training process depends on what we call your career thrust, what you want to do. Do you want to be a case officer, right? Do you want to be what we call a reports officer, someone who processes the information that case officers collects to make sure it's written into a format that can be disseminated through the intelligence community? Or do you want to be a support officer? Actually, some of my favorite officers in the agency were support officers who could, when you're way out in somewhere in the hinterlands of Afghanistan, your logistics lifeline is crucial, and having a good support officer.
I've absolutely seen the best.
You know how it is.
Best. Yeah. In the CIA, I've seen the best support officers, logistics officers.
Yeah. We actually have amazing logistics and support officers.
Yeah.
And then people that keep the money moving, and particularly today, we've been so successful working with other agencies to control the flow of illicit funding that we, the CIA, find it hard to move our money. I mean, if you recruit someone in Beijing or Moscow, and need to pay them, you can't send them a check that's issued by the U.S. Treasury. So you've got to find ways, and sometimes you can't even get money into a country, right?
Yeah.
You look at a country like Russia or China with their firewalls. How do you pay someone in there? So, now with all this digital banking and Bitcoin and stuff like that, there's other ways, but it requires continuous attention and continuous change because technology moves so fast.
There's a counterintelligence threat to doing all that too.
Absolutely.
Do it very carefully.
Right. Absolutely.
I don't think we go into more detail than that, but it's a serious issue.
Yep.
Okay, so what can you tell us about case officer training?
So,
because that's what people, when they think of a CIA
Yeah.
officer, that's what people are thinking
of.
Is
case officers,
officer,
right? Which
that's the spy.
Right. Yeah,
they're not really a spy.
They're not really
they're
a spy.
Other people to spy for them.
Yeah, this is the thing. The case officer recruits the foreign national who will be the spy, right? And
case officer is the spook.
Yes.
Who recruits the spy.
Yeah, the spook that recruits the spy. Yeah. Right. And case officers come.
For those listening, you should really check out the YouTube because I think Ralph just embodies exactly what you think of when you think of a spook. It's like this guy looks like
which is to my detriment. I mean, actually, some of our most effective case officers are the one that you don't see coming.
That's why this is the one place from like diversity hires make sense for intelligence operations because like it doesn't make sense for you, Ralph, to go up to that particular contact. It might make sense for a woman or somebody different.
Yeah, but the diversity thing. This is where it gets tricky, right? You want a diversity of languages and capabilities and cultural knowledge, but it doesn't always fit the pattern, I think, of where the mavens of DEIA typically think. For instance, if you're chasing a North Korean and you want to recruit them, the last guy you want to send after them is like a Korean American, because the North Korean guy is going to think the guy's either from South Korea, pretending to be American, or even worse, it's some sort of loyalty test, and the guy's from North Korea, and he's trying to figure out if he's a spy.
Oh yeah.
You want to use
just a normal
some guy
American.
named Bob who learned Korean in school or in the military and speaks it with a horrible American accent.
Right.
Later on the spooky stuff, if you want to do stuff internally in Korea or someone, then yes, you need that. Now you need the other guy or the other gal. And let me tell you, gender too. There's no gender bias in recruiting. Women case officers, some of the best case officers I ever worked with were women officers. All right? And in fact, they have, in my opinion, a much tougher job, right? Because in this male-dominated world, particularly in government, military, in the circles we run in, and other countries, other cultures.
If a woman is going to make contact with somebody, the immediate, if it's a man, what are they immediately thinking? Oh yeah, she's into me.
Right.
It's a very difficult thing.
And so the female case officer has to overcome that. Yeah. And I tell you, I saw so many female officers who were so good at that, overcoming that, and then just creating these astounding relationships, almost like a dependent relationships by the agents. And I saw recruitments that I thought were far stronger and far more enduring done by female case officers than by some of the men, right? And there's some, I won't get into it for operational security reasons, but there are some nationalities out there that actually, my first choice would be to send a female case officer there. Right.
That's kind of what I meant. I mean, it really depends on who you're talking to.
Yep.
And you do your research.
No cookie cutter approach.
And it's like, which of our people is the best suited? Yeah. Because it might be background. I'm like, well, that person plays golf.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Which is
golf.
What we call targeting, right? Which is another career thrust in the Directorate of Operations, right? Where in my day, I was my own targeting officer. In early days, I'm like looking through newspapers and going to speeches and meetings and conferences to look for people who I thought might have access to information of intelligence value. Now we have people who, scour, thousands of databases, right? This is a big business for private industry, is to sell all these databases they collect from the open web or the dark web, right? And they sell these things to the government, and we pour through them so that, you're looking for someone who not just has access to information, but is someone you can get close to, right? Like, sure, you want to, for the best access, you want to recruit like the foreign minister of a country or the prime minister, but good luck getting in touch with those people, and good luck even if you did recruit one of them. Now those are people who are constantly in the limelight. How do you run them? How do you handle them? How do you collect information from them without them getting arrested? So you got to find the people around them.
Finding people is important. I want to get back to your personal life, but it reminds me of a question I would get right after October 7th.
Yeah.
How did we not know?
Yeah.
Don't the Israelis have like Mossad and like people have this ideal, I think, of intelligence collection and what the Israeli capabilities are. And it's like, don't they have spies everywhere in Hamas? And I'm like, you don't understand. You can't get in.
Right.
Like it's and to the people who do go in.
Yeah.
Well, they're Palestinians whose families live there, and they're a hell of a lot more afraid of Hamas than they are than they care about how much money you'll give them.
Right. And that brings us to another career thrust, the counterintelligence officer, right? And we have them, and so does Hamas. And look, Hamas, the counterintelligence people like Yahya Sinwar, the guy who was famously killed, with the drone, throwing the stick at the drone there, that he was the military commander of the military wing of Hamas, right? He at one time had been like in charge of counterintelligence. He was ruthless. I mean, he personally tortured and executed Palestinians, Gazans, who they suspected of spying for Israel. In some cases, they were right. In many cases, many cases, they were incorrect. And Palestinians
I don't think they even care, right? It's just
they
about
don't
sending
care.
a message.
Right. It's like Stalin's old saying, you want to make an omelet, you're going to break a few eggs. Well, the Hamas broke a lot of their own eggs in trying to keep their secrets safe. And in the end, they were pretty successful if you look at what they did in Gaza.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So now back to CIA life.
Sure.
What's your favorite show or movie on the CIA?
So, Homeland's pretty good.
Yeah.
They're pretty good.
But what's accurate about it? What's a little bit hard to believe?
What's accurate in there? I think
I've heard it got really good in later seasons.
It did in later seasons. The season in Berlin, I think season 8 or something like that. Berlin, a city I know quite well, was I thought was pretty good. Particularly because there was one scene where she's meeting with the German BND, and I recognized it as a restaurant where I used to meet with the German BND. So
really?
They got
wow.
Someone's got some pretty good insight.
Yeah. Well, they got some people working for the show.
Yeah,
that know their stuff.
Another good, some of the other shows I really like. Lioness is a really good one.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I think that there are female officers who are capable of handling themselves in dangerous situations. That I think Lioness goes way beyond the pale in terms of shoot 'em up. But
yeah, because I was going to say, I was like, isn't it a little exaggerated?
Yeah.
I've only watched maybe.
But it's fun to watch. But they do get into I think some things correctly about the interplay between case handlers and agents and things like that. So I found that to actually be pretty good. And then anything by John le Carré.
What has he done?
He's the Brit. And in fact, he had been a British MI6 officer early in his career. And then he went on to writing. His books are mostly famous from the Cold War era. Yeah. Smiley's People, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. What's the great one? They just had that movie not too long ago. It escapes me, but John le Carré, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy.
Oh yeah,
brilliant,
that's a good one. Yeah.
Brilliant. That is the absolute best. It's a Cold War gem. But then after that, he started to branch out. After the Cold War, he started to write about things like terrorism and gun running. He had the Night Manager, which is about an international arms dealer, and then. What was it? A Man Most Wanted, which was kind of a counterterrorism thing, also set in Germany, with the late Philip Seymour Hoffman plays a German counterintelligence officer, and he was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. But anything by John le Carré is worth watching.
Yeah,
yeah.
I like the comedies, like the recent ones. The Recruit, I think, just came out with the second season. I haven't started watching it yet. It's funny just because it really gets to your typical government administrative bureaucracy, like silliness that we deal with, and it's just.
Or as you mentioned, The Patriot.
Yeah, the Patriot's way better. That's my favorite, hands down. I think underrated. Not that many people know about it. I just stumbled upon it on Netflix once, and I was like. I mean, the first episode. It's I don't want to ruin it for anybody because it's just so intense.
How he handles the competition in the business interview.
Right.
Yes.
So he's playing what do you call it? The knock. It's a different kind of case officer, right? Like somebody who's in a completely different. Can we talk about cover? Or is that probably
a little bit? No, as long as we don't get into the details.
But so it's like somebody who's feigning to be a businessman because they need certain access to Luxembourg in this show's case.
Yeah.
But it's just hilariously dark comedy, and it also gets to like again like this the the absurdity of administrative burdens.
Oh yeah,
Like,
which is why
why don't I have a chair yet?
Yeah,
We're still working on that. We got to get it approved, and it's like I'm like, God, that is so perfect, like typical government bureaucracy. Like I don't have a chair. I need a chair.
Yeah,
like well, you can't buy it. We have to buy it a certain way.
Well, that's why I used to love watching the show 24, which was fun to watch, but like
something
you couldn't solve anything in 24 hours. I mean, I said if it were more realistic, 24, the first 6 episodes would be a poor Jack Power sitting in the travel office trying to get his tickets and getting reimbursed.
Do all that. No, instead he tortures literally everyone he meets. I mean, in some creative way.
That's frowned upon as well.
We don't do that. We don't do that. Let's see. There's those. I don't know. I recommend The Paycheck because the character development's excellent.
It's fun. And we like the comedies too because I mean, one of the things that gets you through 35 years of working in CIA is you got to have a good sense of humor. And the thing I'll say too. Yeah, exactly. Right? You're laughing in the face of danger and in the face of dark days. But much like the teams and much like the military, being a case officer, in fact, almost any of the career fields in the agency, it's not a job. I would tell people, if you're looking for a job, if you're looking for a paycheck, don't apply to the CIA, right? But if you're looking for a way of life, right? If you're looking for something, it's a lifestyle. Because like if you're a case officer and you're in a foreign country, right, you are not on duty from 9 to 5. You're on duty 24/7. Right? Maybe you're not sitting at a desk or doing work. Maybe you're with your family or you're shopping.
But even with your family, it's like that's part of the job.
That's part of it, right? Your antenna are always out.
You need to be certain places and you need to have a pattern. There's all sorts. It depends where you are. But and it changes with political developments. You can be in a country that's friendly one day, and then some things happen, and next thing you know, it's not so friendly, right? And then you're pretty much living overseas.
Yes,
I mean all the time. So if you got a family, just buckle up. What is it? How long are tours?
Depends on the location. Like war zone tours are usually like a year, which I think is too short. And then other postings are more like a hardship post, like somewhere in a scruffy part of Africa or Asia would be like 2 years, and then nicer places are like 3 years, maybe 4 years. But with budgetary issues, I think the agency would be wise to look at, extending some of those things because it costs a lot to move people around. Plus, when you get somewhere, your first 6 months are just figuring out where you are, and so then by the end of the first year, you're like, okay, I got it. And then, 2 years in, you really got it. And then your third year, you're preparing to leave. Right? I find too often my colleagues are either reliving their last tour or planning their next tour. And it's like, hey, guy, you're here today. Let's focus on what we're doing here.
Yeah, no, I can see that. I mean, maybe it's helpful to explain to people like why, because a year sounds like a long time to be in Afghanistan.
It is, but we have very generous leave policies. People can get out on R&Rs, and see their families. But
the point is, it takes time to build relationships.
It does, and you look at like Afghanistan. One of my favorite sayings is, we didn't fight a 20-year war. We fought 21-year wars in Afghanistan, right? And so people were constantly relearning what the last crew knew, right? And that took time. And that's
I think, a way to put it. And in the military is even worse.
Yeah.
Now again, our job is different, so you can wrap your head a little bit more around 6 to 8 month deployments. But it's also why, on the intelligence side, military has trouble working with the agency historically because you guys would look at us, and I've dealt with this in my military career a lot, and they're like, okay, so when do you leave? In a few months? No, we're not talking, and we're not approving your operation. We're just not doing it.
But it helped us with working with indigenous forces. In the war zones, I worked a lot with some paramilitary projects dealing with the locals, and because we were there longer, and also because our contractors tended to rotate in and out all the time, we developed these really deep relationships with our indigenous partners there, and that endured, to the point where, that's what kind of saved the day on the, when Afghanistan collapsed and people were trying to get out, right? There were, our forces there were instrumental in clearing the airport and keeping it open to get people out of there.
Close we could.
So the payoff came at the end of a disastrous little foray there.
Yeah, I mean, it's that entire situation was full of guys like you and guys in the military just calling old phone numbers, and doing their best to organize from the outside. It was horrific.
Yeah,
some
real moments of heroism. Yeah.
Bad policy decision. I don't know. I think not in hindsight. We definitely saw that one coming.
Yeah.
Go back to the fun conversation. Well,
Yeah.
so what's the silliest myths that you see in Hollywood about the CIA?
So,
There's no Jason Bournes. There's no super soldiers.
there's some guys who are pretty lethal.
Yeah, for sure. But
Yeah, but I think they were lethal before they ever came in the agency. No, look, I think we're not as great as some people think. We're not as bad as other people think. Our critics really think we're like, clowns in action, or that we never get anything right because our failures are out there for everyone to see. Our successes are hidden, right? So I frankly like it if our adversaries underestimate us, right? And in terms of mythology, the main thing about a case officer is, again, you're just a human being. You're a normal person, and you've got, across the agency, the employees, they're just normal people who, you've got civil war brewing in Turkey, but their kids got soccer practice, right? Or they've got orthodontist appointments to worry about, and so people. I said earlier, it's a way of life, and so the hardest thing is for people to balance, their life with their job, and it's hard, and not everyone can do it. And you see that, in the movies with James Bond in a tux hanging out in casinos, and I'll have my vodka martini shaken not stirred. I mean, there is a lot of drinking in intelligence work, trust me. Yeah. But it's not quite as glamorous, and the glamour factor is really low. And there are moments of sheer terror, but they are far, far, far outnumbered by moments of boredom, and doing administrative tasks and filling out paperwork and listening to speeches from your bosses and things like that. But, there's nothing better than getting out on the street. And the one thing the movie gets right, I think, particularly Le Carre movies, they get the loneliness of the case officer. You're on your own out there, right? Preparing everything for an intelligence operation is a team sport, but when the case officer gets out on the street, that's, this is one-on-one. This is the case officer against the host country counterintelligence forces, or against their police, and trying to meet with someone and not get caught and not get that person caught and executed, right? The tension there, that is, I think, realistically portrayed in many movies. What is incorrect is, I was a station chief 6 times, which isn't a record. There's some guys who've had a few more, but it's pretty unusual. But it gave me good insight into what it's like to lead men and women in intelligence operations. And I learned that most of them are just, good people who thrive. The really good ones thrive on that tension on the street. And I think Hollywood gets some of that right. But in terms of, we're not ruthless, and the station chief, usually in Hollywood, the station chief is a guy who cancels the rescue helicopter at the last minute, and leaves the team to die. And then the team comes back and the sole survivor kills the station chief in the end, right? That's pure mythology. I mean, all the station chiefs I've ever worked with, if anything, they would be the ones to make sure the helicopter gets there no matter what, right? So Hollywood gets that part wrong.
Well, then Hollywood has to accelerate the storyline oftentimes. So it does seem like a character is just doing a massive amount of operations all over the world, which is not exactly. That would have to be a pretty special case, right? That's kind of where Homeland.
And we don't have a lot of private jets either, so you're flying coach. Hollywood gets that wrong too. Yeah,
that's another bit. Even I thought, I was like, oh, great, we could see some of these private jets and they don't exist. I was like, well, that's disappointing.
There's a couple, but you better have a damn good reason for flying in a private jet.
So there's also a lot of I think people probably think there's just a lot more power in the CIA than in real life.
Yeah. There isn't, because we're not a police organization, right? And we have no police authorities whatsoever, which is great. Don't need them, don't want them. We're better off without them, right? That's for our colleagues in the FBI, who we work with closely. And in fact, one thing Hollywood doesn't really get right is the CIA does operate in the United States, right? I worked in the United States, but it's, in close cooperation with our FBI brothers and sisters. And it's in very strict adherence to guidelines and laws and regulations on how we interact with what we call U.S. persons, which are not just U.S. citizens. U.S. persons are companies, American people, green card holders, asylum seekers. They're all considered to be U.S. persons, and they are accorded Fourth Amendment rights that are, I think, duly observed and properly respected.
Yeah. The term U.S. persons legally applies to just people who are here.
Yeah.
I mean, broadly, people or things that are here.
There are times when it's, I think, too broadly applied, but that's not my call. And we operate within those restrictions.
Well, what I found, and we're debating FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which was a big fight about a year ago. Would be another big fight in a year. Maybe less of a big fight, honestly. But, the conversation, the debate was fundamentally around the protections for U.S. persons. And like, the more I just being on the Intelligence Committee and I get to see it, I'm like, we're not even reaching even close to the barrier of what we're legally allowed to do.
That's right.
It's actually a problem. But people think it's the opposite. People think we're reaching past it.
Yeah.
And maybe the FBI did in some cases, and obviously Crossfire Hurricane is a major breach of that. But that's not even what we were debating.
Right. But those are exceptions, not the rule. This is the problem is, I'm sure listeners out there say, well, of course the CIA guy is going to defend it, but the reality is that, the breaches and the violations are exceptions, not the rule. And they are generally investigated and dealt with for the most part, right? And this is where, one of the reasons why I like being here with you today, Dan, is, I have huge respect for congressional oversight. It's important, right? Without it, we might just see the agencies and others return to the days of like the 60s and 70s when all sorts of wacky stuff was going on with, exploding cigars for, Fidel Castro, or spying on student demonstrations or student organizations, right? Yeah. We don't need any of that stuff, right? And congressional oversight, the agency gets it right now. In the old days, I can remember early in my career, some of the people I met from our congressional affairs office, they were essentially guys from overseas who were sent to go dry out, and then we wondered why our relationship with Congress wasn't good, but we were sending people there who, probably shouldn't have been done it. We had some good ones, of course, too, but they were, their job was made even tougher by having, people dumped on them that they didn't want. Now, when we assign people to the Office of Congressional Affairs, it's a competitive process, and we pick good people.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's and I went to visit the UK and our counterparts on their, intelligence committee in Parliament, and I'm like, what do you guys do? And they're like, well, we ask questions. I'm like, okay, well, but like, do you control budgets or authorities? And they're like, nope, we can ask questions. It's like a pure democracy, right? Winner takes all. The PM the Prime Minister runs the show, and they really don't have any oversight power. And that seems to be the case in most countries. We're actually pretty unique there. So we do have the good relationship is necessary, and the open relationship is necessary. It kind of keeps the wheels on the bus there.
Yeah, absolutely.
You mentioned sometimes you're terrified. Do you have a story you can share about maybe one of these tours?
So terror comes, for us case officers, terror comes in two forms. The first terror is that you're going to screw something up and your reputation in the hallway back home will never survive it. There are times when we would prefer prison in Malaysia than coming back to headquarters to deal with an operation that you screwed up. It's like, I can get out of prison, but when I'm at headquarters, my reputation is dead for good. One thing I like to joke is if you have 3 or more case officers in a group talking, we just love to talk about our colleagues and each other, and it's where political assassination is forbidden by law. Character assassination is a huge tradition in the DO, so we can be pretty catty. So the idea of going back to headquarters after a failed operation is worse than death. So that's one form of terror, and I think that's the biggest terror. The other terror is when you're out on your own, or if you're in a war zone or something like that, right? We're not soldiers, and we're out in Iraq. I had some scary moments in Iraq when I was out there, some scary moments in Afghanistan. But even worse is if you're by yourself, and you could be in a East European country on foot on your own, and you're in the wrong part of town, and maybe that night you're crossing paths with a crime gang or something like that, and there's no one there to help you. So I've had a few moments where I've had moments of both. I've had like being out in Iraq, and all of a sudden mortar fire comes in, right? And there's nothing you can do with that, particularly if you don't have a foxhole. And then on the streets in some European countries, which are considered pretty safe, but being out by myself late at night and all of a sudden drawing the attention of criminal elements.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, because that's just the life. You're supposed to be out and whatever that's for a meeting or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's just, you wouldn't want to be in certain areas of Houston.
Yeah, exactly.
It's similar.
Yeah. But our officers are so driven to complete an operation, right? That, and to protect the asset that they're meeting. Like, for instance, we had an officer who in Moscow a few years back went out, was able to escape from surveillance, what we call going black, and then, spent hours off the grid. And of course, the Russians knew this and they were infuriated by it. And they knew that, okay, he's been gone so many hours, so he must be meeting an agent. So the order was, don't let that guy back in the embassy, right? So when that guy returned to the American embassy, he was attacked by the Russian guard outside the embassy, who tackled him, broke his shoulder, right, and then tried to keep him from the embassy. And our guy literally had to fight this guy off and get back into the embassy because he had on him, notes and things like that would have incriminated the person he met with, and that person would have been arrested, tried, and probably executed. So by fighting off this goon in uniform, he was able to save his agent's life. And that's on YouTube. There's video footage from the cameras out there showing this our officer getting attacked. Yeah.
When was that?
I forget the year, but it must have been 2015, 15, somewhere in there, maybe.
Yeah. We're trying to be in Russia, but they just invaded Ukraine for the first time.
Yeah. Well, they've changed the rules. I mean, in the Cold War years, and I spent some time in Moscow early on, and in the Cold War years, there were rules, right? You were under surveillance. But they left you alone, and you didn't mess with them too much, right? If you pissed them off, then you found a nail in your tire the next morning, So they would signal you like, okay, stop driving, to provoke us. But the rules have changed, and they've been thrown out the window, and now we're dealing with Russian services that aggressively hunt down not just active spies but retired spies. The incident in the UK with the former GRU agent Skripal when they went after him with nerve gas, and other places where they've tried to track down defectors and kill them, because they want to put out the message, go ahead, spy for the Americans, no matter what it takes, we'll hunt you down no matter where you are and kill you. Yeah. So it's a much different game these days.
Think about, I guess, the old games. I mean, the show The Americans. How prevalent was Russians' operations of that nature?
Yeah,
that's quite an investment.
Yeah, a very big investment. But it's a different mentality. For instance, you mentioned earlier we call our officers who go out under non-official cover NOCs, right? What do the Russians call theirs, right? It's carryover from the KGB. They call them illegals. Right, illegals, because they're like, our people are in that country illegally. Right?
Interesting.
If you watch Bridge of Spies, that's actually a pretty brilliant film as well, with Tom Hanks and the spy exchange for Gary Powers, right? And the Soviets and then their Russian successors, they just play it on a whole different level. You look at the 10 people that were arrested with Anna Chapman and the others, right, that were exchanged. There was sort of like a sense of comedy around those people, just because it seemed like their tradecraft was bad and they were kind of inept. But that's not true. These were 10 people who were slowly burrowing into American society, and luckily they had been betrayed earlier on by what we call a penetration of the other side. And so the Bureau was able to put together a good case against these people and track them, and then finally swooped in at a time that was deemed convenient for arrest. But the fact of the matter remains that the Russians are very good at exploiting the open societies of the West to put their spies and saboteurs out there. You look at the spate of sabotage and attacks in Europe, right, since the invasion of Ukraine, what we call the gray zone, or irregular warfare, and stuff like incendiary devices on DHL aircraft, or mysterious explosions in factories. I mean, the Russians were preparing for the invasion of Ukraine. There were artillery shell factories in Bulgaria were being blown up, and artillery depots in Bulgaria were being blown up before the invasion, right?
Interesting.
Because the Russians were like, okay, what are the Ukrainians going to need to beat us? Artillery, right? So they went after the supply chains for this stuff.
Yeah, you definitely get the sense they have just less rules. That's
as
the thing
in
about a
no rules.
dictatorship.
There's
And
no rules.
You're saying there's less rules than there even used to be. There used to be sort of a gentleman's agreement with the Soviets. But even then, they would use tactics that we would consider or we would not consider using. I mean, whether it's compromise, right? Like a familiar Russian term. You compromise somebody, basically blackmailing them.
Right.
Is that, why is that bad for us in the long term? Why would we not?
Yeah, I mean, for two reasons. One, compromise. If you recruit someone based on compromising them or blackmailing them or essentially victimizing them, right? That relationship isn't going to last very long, right? Mm-hmm. You might get what you need immediately, but you're sowing that case, what we call the case, right? Is you're sowing the seeds of the destruction of that case right at the start. We prefer recruitments to be based on the other person willingly signs up, right? It's not coerced. Our adversaries are a little bit different. They're okay with coercion, right? And also there's that thing, that old, belief of never sink to the level of your adversaries. Right? And particularly, you look at this evil access of Russia, North Korea, right, Iran, right, and backed by China, right. I always joke, like, how'd you like to be at their dinner party? Not
cool.
Yeah.
Not cool.
Not cool.
They're not fun.
Yeah. They're just not fun.
They're just, the Russians might be fun.
They can be. Mixed with vodka, they can be fun.
Yeah. It's
well, that's the tragedy too. Actually, the Russian people. There's some great Russian people, and
that is the tragedy. Iran, obviously, the same. I mean,
same.
Iran is not like the rest of the world.
Iranians are dying to be friends with America.
Yeah, you get along well with Iranians, and it kind of brings me back to another, because you mentioned, of course, there's stations in the U.S. You've worked in the U.S. and I want to make sure that the audience understands, like, it's not to spy on you, right? It's because there's a foreign intelligence necessity for doing that, right? It's some of our best recruitments will be people who fled their country. Like Houston has a ton of Iranians. LA has a ton of Iranians. They came to the U.S. because they like the U.S.
Absolutely.
And they might have some information on.
Right. And look, China floods our country with intelligence collectors. And if we're going to,
on the one hand, that's a threat to us. On the other hand, it's
an opportunity. It's like, if you're going to send your spies here, we're going to recruit some of them and run them back at you. Yeah. We're going to make it hurt for you, China.
Yeah. I just want people to be clear on, the whole FISA debate on. Going back to FISA. And I tell people, like, the reason this was a debate, and we did have to kind of open up the program publicly a little bit to win that debate. And so, if you're not going to talk about it, but I will, because I've said it a million times on publicly. The fight was over whether you could query, which means search a database, search a FISA database for an American person's name without a warrant. And on the one hand, people are like, no, you're spying on them without a warrant. I'm like, that's not what you're doing. You're searching a database. What's the database? The database is basically a wiretap database. I tell people, look, if a cop gets a wiretap and a judge's order, because you have a warrant for this person, it's a foreign intelligence officer or it's a terrorist or whatever. They talk to people. That's the whole point of the warrant and wiretap. And FISA is just a really fancy wiretap. And so the only difference being, and what the cops don't do is ignore the other side of the conversation, right? That's part of the lawful collection, even though you don't have a warrant on whoever you called. The only difference with FISA is you could search all those recordings. And that doesn't, they've already been recorded, and lawfully so. And what I also point out to people is, like, there's a real degradation to our national security if you demand a warrant, because you won't get them, first of all, because now you need probable cause. And well, what if you just happen, and I'll use the example, what if a terrorist is talking about a U.S. person, but again, the U.S. person doesn't have to be a person. It can be a company in Florida that teaches pilots to fly. And so let's call it like Aeronautic Florida. So what, you can't query Aeronautic Florida? You need to, because you need to know that they've also, that name has been mentioned by other terrorists too, also applying for pilot, training. Like, you're not going to connect the dots between the domestic problem and the outside one, and that is a major threat at a time when the threats to America haven't changed. Like there's still a lot of people who want us dead.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I mean, like take the case of Edward Snowden, right? A guy who I really detest and loathe.
It's the worst. He's so full of shit too.
He is, but here's the tragedy of poor little Eddie is he did come across, I think, some overreach by the federal government in terms of
the metadata collection, right? But that's not what he could have stopped there. And
if he had stopped there,
but he just leaked a shit ton of documents that got people killed.
Yeah, he did. He stole millions of pages of intelligence and then first fled to China and then fled to Russia.
Yeah, it was kind of obvious. So you're not some patriot doing this for the right reason. You're not a whistleblower. There's a whistleblower. There's a way to be protected as a whistleblower.
Yeah.
And maybe we would have seen you totally differently. And we did change that, how metadata was collected after that. But I say he's full of shit because I remember seeing interviews with him and how he talked about our capabilities at NSA. And I was like, as a SEAL, I ran teams that have NSA net. Like after I got blown up, I had to kind of move into like a non-combat role. Yeah. So I did I worked a lot with the agency. I worked a lot with in these programs. Yeah. I'm like, I know exactly what they can do. Yeah. And it's not what you're saying. Yeah. Like it's just not. Yeah. And we're targeting terrorists abroad. I mean, and we still can't do what you're saying that we're doing to Americans. It's just not true. He was just he had this self-aggrandizement that's just infuriating.
And he was a serial non-completer. I mean, he never finished anything in his life, and tells people, "Oh, I went to special forces and I left because I broke my legs." He had shin splints, right? And stuff like that.
I had shin splints too.
Yeah,
which did turn into a broken leg. But you know what? I healed up and went at it again. Yeah. I got to do Hell Week twice. Yeah, so
and full disclosure, I detest the guy because he did have a negative impact on some stuff I was doing at a point in my career that was.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I won't get into it, but
I exaggerate when I say you got people. I mean, I think at least assets got killed.
Yeah, there were. Yeah.
I mean,
there were, and a lot of collection capabilities were exposed, and a lot of relationships with other governments were severely damaged because of him. So
no, not a good dude. He went to the same high school as my wife. Like everybody remembers him too. Like they were like, oh my God, that's the guy who he never had any friends. Yeah. Everybody has the same memory of Edward Snowden from that high school. It's like he always had this giant trapper keeper. It's just like rushing to class all the time, and never talked to anybody, never had any friends, which kind of tells you something here. It's like he was always looking to be something more than he was. And I think that leads to
and the other tragedy too, Dan, is he was able to exploit, I think, within the intelligence community. After 9/11, the intelligence community. We got all paranoid about stovepipes, right? Can't have information, can't be stovepipes. So, and we went from need to know to need to share. Whereas I say we went from need to know to want to know, right? And Snowden was able to gain access to all sorts of programs and intelligence that he, under old circumstances, might never have had access to. Mm-hmm. And these are one of the things I think now, with the current administration talking about reforming the government, I think they're on the right path here. We're thinking like, hey, how do we fix this? How do we get put some sanity back into
it's a really hard problem to
classification and
solve.
protection?
Yeah, one we overclassify.
Yep.
I'll read things all the time. I'm like, I'm sorry, why is this classified? I can read this on the news in 5 seconds. And then we have to be careful because now we're breaking rules if I even say it.
Yep.
Even though it's already in the news. Yeah.
Right.
So
and what we call human collection, we call it the collection of last resort. Mm-hmm. Right. If you can get information any other way other than recruiting a human being, right, or stealing it through a cyber activity or something, if you can get it any other way, do that. Mm-hmm. Right. And save your intelligence capabilities for the last. And I think it got to the point where that wasn't the case anymore. We were using human collection in some cases because it was easy, or it seemed easy. It was sexy. It was cool.
Yeah, that's what your job. Right? It's like you're trained to do it. I want to do it.
But if you're producing reports, you're going out, you're meeting a human asset, you're collecting information. That person is putting their life, their reputation, their career on the line. And if you're collecting information that nobody cares about, nobody's reading, right? And we have much better ways of tracking when reporting gets put into the system. Does anyone actually read it? Then you're spinning your wheels for nothing. And I think now, these are things that our new D&I and our new director, Radcliffe, and all these are issues that they can tackle and try to fix.
Yeah, well, and fix it, but it's always going to be a rub, right? Like figuring out how much stovepiping is necessary, compartmentalization versus the sharing. And we established task forces and all sorts of things to to fix these
and,
problems.
And there's a cultural side to it too. Like, for instance, when I came in, I can remember sitting in meetings as a young officer, and they'd talk about some stuff, and then all of a sudden they say, okay, we're going to move on to, Operation Deep Blue. Anyone not cleared for this, leave the room. And you just got up and walked out, right? Nobody left in a huff. Nobody insisted on staying.
Well,
right?
it's like, reminds me of that scene in The Recruit, with all the lawyers sitting around at a table, and like the head, what would you call him, the legal counsel, he's like, how's the thing going with the guy?
Yeah.
It's going well, like 2 weeks. Good. Don't tell me anything else.
That's right.
And it gets to like the new guy, the new recruit. He's like, okay, so I talked to Razanoff or whatever. He's like, shut up. Everyone shut up. Don't say anything.
That's right.
It's just absolutely hilarious.
It's like The Sopranos. You're kind of like, hey, I got to go to that place to talk to that guy about that thing.
Yeah. I mean, but there's, that makes sense in some ways.
But we got away from that. And after 9/11, and here's the two big sins of 9/11, in my opinion. One was, we created an incredible counterterrorism machine, right? It took some time. We got bin Laden and we destroyed Al Qaeda. And then when ISIS popped up, we destroyed them too, right? But I think we were so focused on counterterrorism for too long that we stopped looking hard at Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. Yeah. We gave them essentially a 20-year head start. If anyone wants to talk about an intelligence failure, that's the failure, where the intelligence community, got so wrapped in counterterrorism that they took their eye off the ball. And as an old Russia guy, I can remember speaking up a few times, like, "Hey, what about that?" And they're like, "No, we're busy with this other stuff." Right, so we're trying to make up for that now, I think, in terms of refocusing.
Yeah, the focus is definitely there now. It's but like you said, there's a head start. And the same with the military as far as just weapons capabilities.
Yeah.
We've been investing in these more boutique kind of counterterrorism capabilities, and forgot to build anti-ship missiles. And it turns out those things are complicated. Yeah, it's not like World War II where you just like, hey, Rosie the Riveter, just go at it. No,
we can buy some from the Ukrainians. Their Neptune's pretty good.
They've done amazing things. I mean, we've benefited massively.
Yeah.
So we've gone over Russian tactics. One thing I found, especially kind of growing up in Latin America, is there's this definitely belief system out there that it's like the CIA overthrew a government. Yeah. And I'm always like, are we really that powerful? I mean, do we have that much influence? I mean, and is there any cases where it's true? Because like in Latin America, it's often used more as like a cudgel. I mean, people are looking for a scapegoat, right? They're looking for a scapegoat for why their country is in where. Well, it's because you made us into a banana republic. It's like, are we that powerful? Did we make you like do this? The Ukraine, the most recent ones, like the stuff about like our government overthrew or had a hand in the Ukrainian protests in 2014 that caused Russia to. It's all our fault.
Yeah, it's baloney. I mean, I can't speak to the agency of the 50s and the 60s or even the 70s, but
so there's some truth to it, like back then. That's kind of
in the past, in the past, right? A covert action, but this is the thing, the agency, right, are the only missions that we have, right, are to collect human, right, and to conduct covert action in support of the White House's policy goals, right, through the NSC. And then, the director of analysis has to produce the high quality analysis to support all that. That's it, right? There's, nothing in there about overthrowing governments or taking over the planet or, anything like that. But
and if there was, it'd have to be presidential.
Right.
Like you're doing this.
Exactly. And that's the thing. The idea of a rogue agency is it's just impossible. Right. Mm-hmm. You could have a rogue officer. You could have someone who goes out there and gets ahead of their brief and upends a policy or, creates an embarrassing situation in a country. But that's an individual, and those people are generally, fired and then probably prosecuted, right? It doesn't happen often either because oversight is pretty tight. And it isn't just congressional oversight, but internal oversight as well. And covert action, it's not a silver bullet. And where the agency went wrong in the past is when administrations would task the agency to do something, and that was it. Where, the agency is going to go take care of, Slobodan Milosevic. No, it works when covert action is just one part of a coherent government-wide strategy, right? You need State Department in for the diplomatic side to build coalitions, and you need Treasury in there to come up with the sanctions policies and the targets of sanctions. You need commerce and trade to figure out, also to help on the economic front, right? And then you need DOD to figure out how to put pressure on the military short of war, right? So you need across the government, and covert action is just one other tool that fits in there. Right, and then this all gets coordinated towards one policy goal. And if you don't have a policy goal, right, then your covert action is doomed to failure. Right, because you can't say, all right, let's create this armed force and send them into Venezuela. What are they going to do? Well, we'll figure it out when they get there. No, it has to be, we've got these sanctions, we have this diplomatic policy, we have this coalition of countries, right, all towards, a hypothetical case of removing the Venezuelan government, right? So that's not the CIA. That's the U.S. government across the board.
Right. It's the whole thing.
Yeah.
What do we tell people the difference is between clandestine and covert action? What's the thing we can say?
Well, I mean, covert action, clandestinity are the things you do to keep things secret. Right, and covert is just the overall. This is
the hand is hidden.
The hand is hidden, right? Or people talk about plausible deniability, which generally turns out to be implausible deniability, but we stick to it anyways.
Yeah. That'd be a last resort. It's plausibly deniable. Let's not get there. Let's not have to deny it. Let's be more careful than that.
That's right.
I think if people hear covert action, I think they're thinking a little bit more in terms of Jason Bourne, but it's really a variety of tools.
Yeah.
I think I was like, you'd be more surprised by what we're not doing than what we're doing.
Yeah.
just generally, just because I see it all, and from the congressional oversight perspective of. And I think a lot of members feel this way. It's like, you should be going more. We want you to do more of that.
Yeah.
And it's not overthrowing a government.
Yeah.
It's, again,
and that seems
some exceptions
to be,
in the 50s and 60s.
Right. And that seems to be the message of the current administration is do more.
Yeah.
Why aren't we doing more? Right. And so, the CIA, under the new director, I think we'll see them in the future being tasked once the administration has their policy goals defined and they start to assign the tasks to the different agencies. I think we'll see more covert action. What I have seen in the past with other administrations is overtasking the CIA with covert action. They have to be careful. Don't give them too much homework to do. It's just like with your kids. You give them too much homework, and then they're poor across the board. But if you give them focused, policy clear guidance for covert action, it can be actually quite successful.
Yeah, because politicians like this third option idea.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, well, I don't have to send the military in, but we're not really getting what we need with State Department. So we've got this sexy third option, which may be the right call. It just depends.
Right.
One of the challenges that's up and coming and big priority for President Trump and me, I feel very lonely about this priority in Congress. Everybody likes to talk about it, but I don't see a lot of action. Is the cartels in Mexico?
Yeah.
And this is going to, if we go fully into it, I mean, it's difficult because there's a law enforcement element to it. And it's like, can you prosecute your way out of this problem, or is this a military target, or is this the third option target, or is it just a mix of all of it? And I think that the answer is a mix of all of it. And the question is, how do you properly coordinate that? As we talk about stovepipes, I mean, how do we make sure that like the information the DEA gets from, and they run their what do they call it? Confidential informants, totally different than you guys would.
Right.
They don't know what information might be useful to the IC. There's not a great way to make that connection unless it's at the personal level. Yeah. And we're dealing with some insurgency like the cartels.
Yeah. Well, there are some ways though, Dan. There's these joint task force. One of the things that's worked out well in the United States are these joint terrorism task force that are located in almost every major city. And, I've worked with several of them. And, this is another thing that Hollywood gets wrong, although, showing that everyone's fighting each other.
Yeah. Right? My jurisdiction.
Yeah.
Never seen that with cops either. Cops like, your jurisdiction, fine, you got it.
Yeah, exactly.
You go write the report.
Right.
That's always how it is.
I've worked with some of the biggest JTTFs in the United States. And I think, the harmony and the collaboration and the recognition of whose authorities handle which part of the problem, it's so well worked out that, a scriptwriter can't find anything there, I mean, one of my favorite scenes, it was at NCIS, and it was shot in a post office where this guy comes in, sketchy individual, like, maybe Muslim terrorist, and he's checking a mail, a post box. And then another person comes in and they're kind of suspicious looking. And then a woman comes in and even she, with a baby carriage, even she's kind of suspicious. So there's like 6 or 7 people there. And all of a sudden, when the guy finally goes to the mailbox to open it, they all pull out guns and badges, right? They're from 5 different organizations, right? No one coordinated.
What show?
That was NCIS.
That was NCIS.
Yeah.
That's funny.
And it was comical, but it's not like that. And so taking on the cartels though will mean that collaboration will have to be taken to a whole new level, right? These are
we've got a willing
serious
Mexican
adversaries.
government for
the first time. Yeah,
maybe ever. I mean, you look at the Vicente Fox, Calderon eras. They went to war with the cartels. I'm not sure what our involvement. We were busy. We were doing other wars. So I'm not super familiar with like what our engagement was. But it's so much worse now as far as how embedded the cartels are as an insurgency. Call them a terrorist insurgency inside the country, that you can't let this go on forever. And I think the new president agrees. Yeah, they're even like when I say things like that, their embassy's actually retweeting me. I'm like, well, I think we're on the same track here.
Well, the administration already has a couple big wins down there. I mean, on one with reduced traffic at the border, right, or reduced crossings, and second of all, the recent handover of I don't know how many narco bosses, including Rafa Cara Quintero, who was responsible for the murder of Kiki Camarena, DEA, and so that's huge. I mean, they've been at that guy for decades, right? So
you just got a very different mindset now, and because I was just there last week, and like they're like, no, we want to get rid of these guys. I mean, and even the corrupt, like prison. Directors, from around the country, and so the biggest corruption in Mexico is definitely at that level. Because these crime bosses still run their operation out of there. And even the corrupt officials were like, "Thank you for getting rid of these guys," because they're running operations out of my prison. They're killing my people. They're killing guards. They're like it's chaos, and so even the ones getting probably paid off or just threatened. I mean, that's the problem with Mexico. You're either getting paid off or you're being threatened, and you choose how to deal with that. And I met with state police there, and it's just that's just the life. And some can do it, some can't. And what I've told them is like you need massive amount more resources to conduct a counterinsurgency operation, which means fundamentally bolstering your local forces. And there's a playbook for this, as it turns out, and we can do it. And I think we have an actual opportunity to step through that door.
And these joint terrorism task force, I think a lot of them can be, they're still going to have to focus on terrorism, but I think they can be beefed up and also put on this mission because, the cartels have nodes in the United States and they have presence in the United States. So, we're going to have to be sure that we can neutralize whatever nodes or presence they have in the United States if we're going to be successful on the other side of the border. So
it's a giant nexus. Maybe put on you're looking into your crystal ball because of your experiences.
Very cloudy these days.
In Russia and the Middle East, well, maybe we'll start with Israel. It seems like they're right back at war with Hamas. How do you foresee this panning out? Because the West Bank is still just always as unstable as ever, if not more than ever now. What do we?
I think, I spent a lot of time in the Middle East and in Israel and have great respect for both Shin Bet and Mossad, our counterparts there. They're, very professional. And what Mossad did to dismantle Hezbollah, the pagers and the exploding radios and, and just having the intelligence that allowed the Israeli Air Force to take out guys like Hassan Nasrallah, which, a friend of mine sent me a video of the smoking hole that was left where he was. And it's just incredible. And at the same time, then you had, Iran launched 2 attacks on Israel, both of them, which fizzled out, right? Which is a big problem for the Iranians. I'll get to that in a second. In Gaza, the Israelis, yes, they were taken totally by surprise by that. That was Hamas conducted a brilliant deception campaign for several years, and actually I think benefited from Bibi Netanyahu's government, who were so keen to keep things quiet in Gaza. They were very accommodating to Hamas because Hamas propagated this myth that they were trying to somehow shift from terrorism to governance, and because of the Netanyahu's government because of their hatred of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, right? Old I think old scores with Fatah and the PLO overruled their common sense to some extent. But Hamas was able to take advantage of that and surprise the Israelis. Right. The same shame is that Israeli intelligence, in this case Shin Bet, which has jurisdiction over Hamas and Gaza and domestic stuff, they had, similar to us in 9/11, they had all the dots to connect, just didn't connect them right. Right. So this is a lesson in when you have lots of technical intelligence, but not a lot of human. If they'd had one person on the human side, because they had the battle plan, they had the Hamas battle plan, but they chose kind of to ignore it. But if they'd had that one human source that says, "Oh no, that's the real plan,"
but it just seems so ridiculous. That it's like this has got.
But they took them by surprise. In fact, Hamas took themselves by surprise. There's no way they dreamed that they would take the IDF that much by surprise. And I think they had planned to take maybe 20, 30 hostages. Kill as many Israelis in as bloody a manner as they would, because they're kind of like a prison uprising where they wanted to really piss off the guards and then go back in because they wanted the guards to come in and not just kill them, but kill Gen Pop, right? To show the world that the Israelis are horrible. Look, they're killing everybody. And so their barbarism was done with a cold calculation. But they were so successful, they don't even know how many hostages they took. I mean, you had average Gazans, right? Heard how chaotic it was out there. They were jumping in their cars and driving into Israel and kidnapping people, right? And so then Hamas was driven underground, and then very cynically, they're like, okay, the IDF is going to bomb the crap out of us. They're going to kill thousands of our people, and then we're going to trade, right? But instead, they had so many hostages. They had wrought so much havoc that, the Israelis just went in there and just pounded them. And we have, the situation where we have now when, Gaza virtually destroyed. But that has, what was amazing there is the breathing space it's brought them with Hezbollah when they destroyed Hezbollah. And then hitting the Iranians, as I said earlier, the Iranians launched 2 attacks on Israel, and neither one really came to anything. In fact, Israelis were then able to go and for the first time, Netanyahu showed amazing restraint where he didn't really pound Tehran. They hit a few targets, and it was kind of messages like, we can hit you anytime we want, and we can hit you as hard or as soft as we want.
And you can hit back, and just catch the punch.
And we'll just catch the punch. And so I think now, with this, Vladimir Putin, I think, is being heavily distracted by his negotiations with the Trump administration over Ukraine. And I think that means he's maybe not paying as much attention to Iran right now. And I think the Israelis are going to look at that, and they have an opportunity to say, you know what, let's take advantage of this, and let's go pound the Iranian nuclear sites.
Do you think they will? Hard to say.
Hard to say, but I think there's more argument in favor than against it right now. Because here's the thing, Dan. Everyone says, well, they need the bunker buster bombs to get down in there. No, they don't. These underground facilities, all they have to do is destroy the air shafts, block the entrances and exits, right? Bury these things, and then they tell the Iranians, go ahead, dig them up, we'll bomb them again. Right? So they can close these things down.
You don't need Tom Cruise to do the cool, into the backflip, hit it has to be
we tried that in the early 2000s and didn't work so well. But, there is a window there for the Israelis to really put a damper on the Iranian nuclear program. This isn't my crystal ball, these are my personal assessment. The only thing that will change in Iran, anything in Iran, is regime change.
Yeah.
Right? The mullahs have to go. And the Iranian people are aching for that. They are aching for that. And I think at some point, due to the demographics, right, a fast-growing young population that needs economic prosperity that's been denied to them. I mean, the last time when the Israelis hit Iran and the Iranian response was ineffective, the Iranian people made fun of the IRGC. They made fun of the government. They said, okay, we've been suffering under sanctions. We've been undergoing economic deprivation for decades now, and this is the best you could do. Right? So there's an undercurrent there, I think, that at some point could be exploited by the West and into getting rid of the regime. And if you could get a new Iranian regime that would come in and say, we renounce nuclear weapons and we recognize Israel, man, that would change the face of the Middle East overnight.
So that's Iran, but I mean, like closer to Israel, and they still have Gaza. It's not what it was.
Yeah.
Who the hell's gonna govern it?
Yeah.
The West Bank is as fragile as ever. You got Abu Mazen.
Yeah. That's the one to worry about too.
And Israel's doing. I mean, I recently saw military operations there.
Yeah.
What? How does this? Is there a way to predict how these chess pieces end up on the board?
Yeah. So my vision of Iran with the overthrow, that's like the happy ending. The sadder, more likely ending is renewed bloodshed in the West Bank that will really, I think, push the other Arab countries there. Like you look at Saudi Arabia, which they're dying to have normal relations with Israel. And in fact, they were really on the path to that when Hamas launched the attack. And it's one of the reasons why Hamas did attack, right? They saw normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel as, coming down the pike. And they knew that once that's accomplished, they would be largely irrelevant. If the Arab world started to recognize Israel and ignore the Palestinian conflict, then Hamas's days were numbered. Right, so they disrupted that heavily. So that's kind of back on the table. But if Israel goes in with too heavy a hand in the West Bank, that'll be off the table again. And they'll be, I think, their timetable for normalizing with anyone in the Arab world will be pushed back.
Well, this continues to be a problem because Israel's not willing to. It doesn't seem to me they're willing to entertain the two-state solution like they used to be. The security concerns are too grave, and so who the hell governs? But they don't want to govern Gaza either. And I guess there's a semi-plan with the Jordanians and Egyptians to do something. I guess this is the beauty of Trump winning. I would argue is a simple paradigm shift. Right. If you had Kamala Harris win that, she would be, even if she didn't want to be, kind of stuck within the same policies, which is sort of support Israel, but also criticize them and then keep supporting and on Ukraine and Russia issue. Not talking about a peace deal, but instead, keep supporting them until Russians back off, which really has no end in sight.
Right.
So there's a benefit to this paradigm shift, at least trying it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, and with, Israel, the problem for Israel, though, is they've got 4 conflicts going on, right? One is with Gaza, with Hamas. One is with Hezbollah in the north. The third is with Iran. And the fourth is the internal conflict amongst Israelis themselves.
Domestic politics in Israel are very intense.
Yeah, very intense. And this is what's preventing, if the Israelis can't decide their own future, how are they going to come up with a policy to decide a future between them and the Palestinians?
Yeah. I keep asking if they have a plan, but I don't think they do. I think they're still.
They have a plan for the day. That's it.
Yeah. What about any crystal balls on how Putin will react to, and what do you think he's trying to extract out of these negotiations? We got Ukraine where we got Zelensky where we wanted him. Had to be bullied a little bit, but he kind of deserved it. And we were talking about this before we recorded. It's like, I have to agree with the vice president's comments that you need to say thank you more. I mean, it sounds so simple and petty, but it's not. And even me as a big Ukraine supporter and realizing that the geostrategic necessity of deterring Russia and how much less that costs us in the long run. I do agree that
there's no harm in saying thank you. In fact, you can't say thank you enough. What's the harm in that?
And I agree that there's a time that there has to be a time eventually where you hey, let's try the talking. Let's just we haven't reached out
and absolutely. I mean the problem for the Ukrainians is manpower. They're literally running out of men. Right? They just don't have the manpower. And with Russia, they can continue this for years. The Ukrainians cannot. And under the last administration's policies, the Ukrainians were being given enough to bleed. They were bleeding out, and they weren't being given enough to win. And so I think with some of the Ukrainian, I go there every 3 or 4 months on some of the consulting stuff I do. Full disclosure, I'm very pro-Ukraine. But I was talking to a lot of people, and they over the months I've watched their attitudes change. Recently they started pulling 70% of the country said we just want this war to stop. And the other thing that was interesting, where we talked to an opposition, kind of in the opposition, but does a lot of polling, and said that over the year, ever since the invasion, when they asked people what makes your life difficult, war, right? Number 1 is the war. And number 2 was corruption, official corruption. In the last few months, the poll reversed, and the top problem was corruption. And the war was number 2. And I said, well, how do people justify that? And they said, well, people say, well, we think the war can end, but the corruption will never end here. Right. So there is, I think the administration does have, their mineral deal, right? I read that, and a lot of people were like, "Oh, this is extortion." Well, no, it's not. This is payment. This is an investment. This is a way for the Ukrainians to show America's invested in Ukraine. And I thought the brilliant part of the mineral deal was it was to create a fund that would not go straight to the Ukrainian government, but the Ukrainian government could draw from it. And most of the Ukrainian people I talked to said, "Yeah, that's a good deal because you can't put money in these guys' pockets because they'll steal it." You know, I mean, corruption is a big issue there, and that's part and parcel of figuring out how to pay the bills.
Yeah, it's just good politics too back home when people are weary of even because it's tough to convince them. I can make a pretty good argument, like you're a warmonger, you're just supporting a war. I'm like, well, I didn't start the war. Let's be clear on that. Somebody else did. And you can, well, they had an excuse. Not really. Well, he was afraid if they were joining NATO. Nobody was joining NATO.
Nope.
So sorry, these aren't arguments. They just want the land. Like they've always wanted the land. Just accept that. I think Westerners can't wrap their head around wars of conquest.
And there was anger with Putin was definitely angry at the Ukrainians.
Well, it's sort of just a Russian thing to be.
A Russian
they just
thing.
don't like Ukrainians. I mean, it just dates back a long time. But I'm like, you're the warmonger if you think you're in a better position having a full intact Russian army on the border of 4 more NATO countries, and a Vladimir Putin who now believes we don't really defend our friends. That's a closer situation to war. All that being said, I also I don't think these ideas are contrary to each other. All that being said, you need a deal, like for U.S. interests, like the Ukrainians might complain all day, like, well, we're going to give up territory. It's like, but you still have Kiev.
They're actually willing to do that now. That's the first time. I remember in my earlier trips, people would say, we're never giving up our territory. We're never giving up our land. But, you look at, for instance, like the draft age is 24. It was 25. Right now it's 24. So 24 up to like
slowly
60
going
something,
down.
right?
Some I've talked to.
It's kind of frozen at 24. But, and the reason for that is, that, demographically they're hurting and they're trying to save their kids for the future. Yeah. But, that's where Zelensky had an opening, which I'm surprised he didn't take it more, was by saying, look, okay, if you want all our territory back, then I got to take your 18-year-olds. I can't take back the Donbass without your 18, 19, 20-year-old kids. Right? And then people would be like, oh, wait a minute. I don't want my kid dying in the Donbass.
And I understand what they have to say publicly. Publicly, they go, but no, we'll never stop fighting, because you kind of have to stay that.
But behind the scenes, they're saying it.
What do you think Putin does at this point?
Depends. I mean, he's, it's hard to get in that guy's mind. And I think it's going to depend on, how threatened he feels. Like, like you said, the president has Zelensky in the right place, right? He's compliant now. And Vladimir Putin is not, and probably never will be. But that doesn't mean we can't get him to do the things we need to make the war end. And I think his future actions will depend on how tough an agreement we can make that protects Ukrainian sovereignty after the guns fall silent, right? And like Crimea, just make it a frozen conflict like the Korean Peninsula. The Donbass, the Ukrainians can just say, have it. We just won't recognize it. We'll put an asterisk on the map like we used to do for the Baltic states, right? Never recognized, the annexation of the Baltic states. That was really brave of us, But, then there's a way, then it comes down to economics, right? Can we rebuild Ukraine, and can the Russians start to rebuild? And the key will be, do they start to retool their economy from a wartime economy to a peacetime economy? Right? And that we'll be able to monitor, right? So this administration or any future administration will have to carefully monitor what the Russians do after the guns fall silent. And also, like these sabotage incidents in the West, do they go up after a ceasefire, or do they go down? Right. So there are several indicators there that we can use. At this point, it's a fool's errand to try and predict which way it'll go. But once the guns fall silent, there are things that the intelligence community can monitor to give the administration a heads up.
It's a very narrow needle to thread, because Putin has to be able to say that he won. He can say whatever. I'm like, and
he's got to justify the loss of almost 1 million men.
Well, and also I tell people who are criticizing Trump's plan here, just giving Putin what he wants. I'm like, or you can't let him win. And I'm like, you'll never have a deal if you like, no matter what that deal, he's going to go back to his people and say he won. You just be ready for that psychologically.
No matter what,
to deal with that.
That's a great point.
And then from the American perspective, we got to take a step back and be like, did we totally beat them back? Like, no, but was our strategic, because that's what's important to me, is our strategic deterrence maintained?
Yeah.
And frankly, if you don't get Ukraine, which is what Putin truly wanted, then my opinion is, I mean, it's not the perfect ideal situation here, but we're not willing to commit the amount of threats and resources and risks associated with that to create that outcome. And neither is Europe.
Right.
So let's just all talk about realistic possibilities. I think that's where the administration is smart on.
They are. The administration, I think, has been smart and realistic on that.
Yeah. All right. I kept you longer than I said I would, but I think you knew that going into it because there's so many cool things we could talk about. But
absolutely,
maybe the typical question I always get, and I bet you always get too, is like, what keeps you up at night? Maybe what we're not talking about, and we're talking current events right now. And there's obviously China. We can talk about China for like an hour. Is there anything else that's like?
Yeah, that big asteroid that NASA won't publicize. No, just kidding.
The stuff they found under the pyramids.
No, I'd say what keeps me up at night. Not much. I mean, you work for the CIA for 35 years, and if you let things keep you up at night, you'd never get any sleep. I think I worry mostly about China in the future, right? And I try to explain to my Ukrainian friends who are outraged by political events. I say, look, this is about more than just you guys. There's China here, and if this administration can peel Vladimir Putin and the Russian Federation away from China and disrupt that relationship enough to kind of give China second thoughts on going to war in the Pacific, then that's not a bad idea. So I worry about China and the Pacific. I
would think they'd have a lot of second thoughts just based on the new technologies we've seen from the war in Ukraine. You're dealing with a future of where it's about it's about thousands of cheap drones, right? And like that's really hard to invade an island over a wall of thousands of cheap drones that can take out. You're not going to shoot down 500 of them. Yeah, no, I was meeting with a unit in Kiev this is just last month, and these guys are briefing on, they've destroyed over $1 billion worth of Russian equipment with their drones. And they launched one of the first fully robotic attacks on a Russian position using drones in the air and drones on the ground, right? And this guy predicts that in 6 months, the entire front will be 20 to 50 kilometer wide no-go zone for human beings. He said there'll be just so many drones in the air from both sides and drones on the ground and sensors and mines and stuff that you just can't move. Yeah, it's kind of how I felt in Afghanistan, but just on like a much greater scale. Yeah. We had the air there. Yeah, we had the air there. And so, it does seem like the future looks a bit like a Korean peninsula. Yeah. Just frozen in time. So I'm glad I'm in my 60s and won't have to serve in warfare under that stuff. Yeah. Well, maybe we'll see. Well, hopefully your service isn't done. We'll see. Thanks for your insights on everything and the insights into life in the CIA. Hey, I think thanks, Dan. I enjoyed it. We'll enjoy it. I enjoyed it. Great. Thanks for being on. All right. Take care.